Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. With today's lecture, number 7, we will start the 3 chapters dedicated to liberal theories of peace, liberal theories claiming that peace is possible thanks to economic interdependence, thanks to international institutions, collective security, and thanks to democratic regimes. So today we will look at economic interdependence and peace, at free trade and peace. We saw last week when we looked at John Miller's thesis. According to John Miller, nowadays in developed postmodern societies, there is an obsolescence of major war. Obsolescence because, first, in these societies, war lost its romantic appeal, notably after World War I, and because war is no longer perceived to be economically rational. It is perceived to be economically counterproductive in societies, considering their well-being, their wealth as the overriding objective to pursue. In doing so, John Miller establishes a link with the more general liberal theory, according to which economic interdependence is the best means to permit peace to prevail. This idea, a link between economy or trade and peace, goes back to the 17th, 18th century. I found this in the American sociologist or economist Albert Hirschman's book called Passions and Interests, the French translation, Passions and Interests, and the subtitle is also pretty interesting, Political Justifications of Capitalism before its a triumph. And Albert Hirschman refers to 3 authors, 3 French authors, thinkers of the end of the 17th, first half of the 18th century. The 2 first ones are pretty forgotten. The first one, his name is Jacques Savary, who wrote a book in 1675 called Le Parfait Négociant, The Perfect Merchant. The second one is Jean-François Melon, who wrote a book on trade. The precise title is the following one, Political Essay on Trade, and he put forward this sentence, which already sums up the liberal theory of peace through economic interdependence. Listen to Jean-François Melon: the spirit of conquest and the spirit of commerce. This was the term used at that time, also in the English translation, commerce and not trade. The spirit of conquest and the spirit of commerce mutually exclude one another in a nation. The spirit of commerce and the spirit of conquest mutually exclude each other in a nation. And Jean-François Melon was a friend of Montesquieu, and it is Montesquieu who is famous for having rationalized this theory, this thesis, in his Spirit of the Laws, L'Esprit des Lois, the French original edition, of course, with his very famous Doux Commerce Thesis. Doux Commerce Thesis, translated in English with the phrase "trade, not invade," which somehow directly refers to Jean-François Melon's claim: the spirit of conquest and the spirit of commerce do exclude each other. If you have trade with another nation state, you will not conquer this other state, you will not invade it. Trade, not invade. So it's the English equivalent of the Doux Commerce thesis, which was put forward by Montesquieu in the first 2 pages of the 2nd volume of his Spirit of the Laws. Listen to Montesquieu, the English translation: commerce is a cure for the most destructive prejudices. Commerce heals the most destructive prejudices, for it is almost a general rule. Here starts the thesis. It is almost a general rule that wherever we find agreeable manners, wherever we find agreeable manners, agreeable customs, habits, mœurs douces, there commerce flourishes. And wherever there is commerce, there we meet with agreeable manners. There we meet with agreeable manners. We see every day that commercial laws polish and refine barbarous manners. Commerce polishes and refines barbarous manners. So this Doux commerce thesis, how can we explain it? Why did it emerge in the context of the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century? How can we explain that trade, commerce, but also trade in the more narrow meaning of economic exchange, how can we explain that trade was considered to be a peace-prone factor, a pacifying force in international politics in a period, of course, synonymous with colonial conquests, and colonial conquests, military violence, also were undertaken for economic reason, the spices, the gold, the silver, etc., the slaves that European powers found in overseas territories. And Karl Marx, of course, who was very fond of criticizing capitalism, what he considered to be capitalism, made fun of this trade not invade thesis when alluding to today's Indonesian islands conquered by the Dutch. And he said, he wrote this in German, "Das ist der Doux commerce." That's what they call the Doux commerce. That's what they call the pacifying trade. He criticized and made fun, actually, of this expression. So to nevertheless understand this somehow serious reason why commerce and more narrowly trade was perceived to be peaceful, we have to remind the general context of the beginning of the 18th century. The general context, and first the linguistic context, and also the sociological context. In the then 17th and 18th century, commerce had a much larger meaning, much broader meaning than, in French, commerce, than trade. It meant social intercourse. And this is the reason why the English translation at that time used the term traffic and not trade. Commerce, which also commerce in French, which is also translated by commerce in English, also was translated by traffic. In German, Verkehr, and not merely Handel. Handel means trade, Verkehr means traffic, even traffic in the meaning of traffic jams, cars on the roads. So social intercourse, social interactions among, ladies and gentlemen, civilized people, among peaceful people. This was the meaning of commerce. And even if we take commerce in the narrower meaning of trade, by definition, commerce was undertaking the fact to buy and to sell, was undertaken by a new rising social class, the bourgeois class, capitalist class, if you prefer this term, whose activities, of course, were peaceful comparatively to the activities of the noblemen, of the aristocrats, whose main occupation consisted in going to war, because they composed the then armies of the monarchies in the 17th, 18th centuries. So to claim that commerce is synonymous with agreeable, peaceful, civilized manners, of course, also alludes to the then rising bourgeois class, inspired by non-aristocratic and therefore guided by non-warlike manners. There where trade flourished, there the manners became more peaceful. The bourgeois class was rising, the aristocratic class and its caste and its values were declining. Concerning now what we are more directly interested in here, that is to say the external aspects of trade among independent units, Montesquieu claimed that the spirit of commerce was indeed a force for peace. Listen to this very important quote. I would like you to remember it. Is at the origin of the contemporary discussions, the contemporary conviction held by a lot of people, according to which there can be no war opposing the Chinese to the US in the future because of economic interdependence, precisely. So listen to Montesquieu. Peace is the natural effect of trade. Peace is the natural effect of trade. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are interested in Montesquieu, you just take your bike and you ride some 30 or 40 kilometers south of Bordeaux to La Brède, where you will find the castle and this library of Montesquieu. So you can have an idea where he wrote his Spirit of the Laws. So listen to Montesquieu. Peace is the natural effect of trade, the natural consequence of trade. Two nations who traffic, this is the translation, who have trade with one another. Two nations who traffic with each other become reciprocally dependent. They become reciprocally dependent. If one has an interest in buying, the other has an interest in selling, and thus their union is founded on their mutual necessities. Their union, peaceful union, is founded on their mutual necessities. So to understand this claim, we have to go beyond, of course, the sociological and also the linguistic context. We have to take into account the political one. You know that Montesquieu criticized during the Enlightenment century the French absolutist monarchy of Louis XIV and Louis XV, Louis XV, when he was living in the first half of the 18th century. So he criticized the absolutist monarchy, you know, that he introduced in France, John Locke's model of doctrine of the separation of powers. He even updated this doctrine in Locke's doctrine written in 1690 in his treatise in second treatise on civil government. Locke distinguished legislative power, executive power, and federative power. The federative power is the power conducting foreign policy. And Montesquieu kept the legislative power, the executive power, but he dropped the third one and he introduced the judicial power. So the three powers are separated in a republican or in a democratic regime. So he criticized the absolutist monarchy, and therefore he also criticized logically the then prevailing economic system, the then prevailing economic policy that was the one put into practice by the then absolutist monarchies. And I guess you know that the then prevailing economic practices were consisting in mercantilism. So to understand why, according to Montesquieu and after Montesquieu, according to liberals up to nowadays, why economic interdependence is a force of peace, we have to first have a look at what the mercantilist doctrine consisted in, because it is against this then prevailing belief that Montesquieu and liberals put forward the idea that peace is favored thanks to interdependence. So let's look at the mercantilist doctrine. The mercantilist doctrine in the domain of economy, economic policy, and international economic relations coincided, the triumph of this doctrine coincided with the rise and the consolidation of the territorial state, the absolutist state that emerged after the Middle Ages, when the first European states unified in Spain, in France, and England. According to mercantilism, a state must have a lot of money. It must have a lot of money in order first to pay the civil servants. Louis XIV was establishing in the first in Europe a fairly significant bureaucracy to take up the growing domestic functions of the state. And the state, of course, at that time, maybe even first and foremost, needed money to pay the mercenaries who composed its armies, with which the states consolidated their unity by getting rid of any kind of rival, either within or at the borders. So absolutist states needed money, first and foremost, to wage wars. And this is what Richelieu said. According to Richelieu, he revisited, he shared the famous Roman slogan, pecunia nervus belli, money is the nerve of war. If you want to fight wars, you need money. Money makes the world go round and makes the war go round to some extent. And Colbert, the French prime minister of Louis XIV, claimed that there was a direct correlation between the amount of money that a state was able to accumulate and a state's power and also prestige. Since there was, ladies and gentlemen, at that time, almost no modern credit and banking system, though the first banks had been invented in the Italian Renaissance, notably at Florence, Medici, also in the then Holy Roman Empire of German nation, Augsburg, the Fugger family, Fugger. Nevertheless, there was no somehow significant banking and credit system. So the states had to look to find money somewhere else. So what did they do? They could obtain money, increase the amount of money which they considered to be at the origin of their power and of their prestige. They could look for such money either to obtain it either through war and conquest, notably overseas, where they found gold and silver. This is what the Spaniards first and foremost did in South America and Latin America. And also they could try to obtain more money thanks to trade. So let's look at the accumulation of money through trade. What did the argument consist in? The argument was the following one. In order for a state to increase its amount of money thanks to trade, this trade, the balance of trade must be positive. That is to say, the state must export more goods than it imports goods produced by other states. And in order for this to happen, to make sure that this would happen, states should practice what at that time was called the famous beggar thy neighbor policy. Beggar your neighbor, that is to say, reduce your neighbor to poverty thanks to trade. Concretely, this meant that states were encouraged to favor their own exports thanks to subsidies. And of course, they were incited to penalize imports thanks to burdens, thanks to commercial burdens, thanks to tariff barriers. And of course, even to some extent before committing themselves into international trade, they were incited to try to be as independent as possible, because as long as you are independent, by definition, you are not at all depending on the goods that you import from somebody else. So states, very concretely, were incited to protect what they were producing, to adopt what nowadays we would call a protectionist policy. So mercantilism was both offensive and defensive. Offensive because it consisted in favoring one's own exports, and defensive because it consisted in protecting the national economy, favoring the national economy, the national industries, in order for them to produce those goods that therefore were no longer needed to be purchased in the form of imported goods from foreign economies, foreign countries. So the Mercantilist Doctrine, to sum up this idea, ladies and gentlemen, was in the domain of international economic relations the equivalent of the realist doctrine in the domain of international political interaction. Trade was considered to be a zero-sum game. Montaigne, another philosopher of the Southwest, his castle is east of Bordeaux, some 80 kilometers when traveling to the Dordogne department. According to Montaigne, someone's gain is another one's loss. Trade is a zero-sum game. You lose or you win or you lose. Both cannot win at the same time. This was the then prevailing conception, which amounts to say that at that time states were incited to have trade if and only if and as long as they were sure to obtain gains, positive gains, to gain more than the other one. In other words, trade was considered to be the continuation of policy, foreign policy by other means, and even as the continuation of wars by other means. As much as war, trade was considered as the best means to become richer at the expense of other nations. Giovanni Botero, an Italian philosopher of the 17th century, he who coined the expression reason of state, ragione di Stato, which is a Machiavellian concept, but which Machiavelli himself did not coin. Listen to Giovanni Botero: trade is the fastest way to grow richer, at the expense of someone else. And there was also at that time an English wisdom, an English statement, anonymous, I found it in Remoiron's Peace and War, where the balance of trade was somehow submitted to the more general balance of power. Balance of power we saw in another chapter. Listen to this English statement, anonymous statement. Aron himself did not know the author. The balance of power can in no other way be maintained or continued but by the balance of trade. So the balance of trade contributes on the long run to the balance of power. If you are not economically rich, you will not be militarily strong as your potential adversary. The balance of power can in no other way be maintained or continued but by the balance of trade. Whoever commands the trade of the world commands the richness in the world, and whoever commands the richness in the world commands the world itself. So if you want to be the dominating power in the world, you must be the richest one. So this context, ladies and gentlemen, that we should have in mind when going back to Montesquieu's claim that trade has a peaceful effect. Trade began to be considered to be peaceful roughly at the 17th, 18th, beginning of the 18th century onwards. Why? Because the Mercantilist Doctrine started to be criticized. It started to be criticized because of what? Because of the then economic evolution, of course. The more economic activities were modernizing, the more or the fastest economic production was growing, the more the idea that the economic well-being and that the power of a state was directly correlated to the amount of money, the stock of money that the state was able to accumulate, the more this idea, of course, was dropped. And it was replaced first by the physiocrats and then by the liberals, who claimed the opposite, who criticized the former balance of trade as a zero-sum game thesis, and who also criticized from the economic point of view standpoint, and who also criticized the politically harmful consequences of the protectionist or mercantilist practices. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, to the first criticisms that were put forward in the 18th century. It is the Enlightenment century. David Hume, he whom we saw in chapter 5 when talking of the balance of power, his interpretation of Thucydides, you may remember this. He also wrote a short essay on the jealousy of trade, And this is what he wrote, criticizing the former mercantilist or protectionist doctrine. Nothing is more usual among states which have some advantages in commerce. Commerce was still the term used, not trade. Nothing is more usual among states which have made some advantages in commerce than to look on the progress of their neighbors with suspicion. A state looks at the other state with suspicion. To consider nothing is more usual than to consider all trading states as rivals. To suppose that it is impossible to flourish, it is impossible for them to flourish, but at their expense. So this was the prevailing mercantilist doctrine. A state can only become richer if and when the other one becomes poorer. In opposition, and here then he puts forward his idea, in opposition to this narrow and malignant opinion, I, David Hume, claim that the increase of riches and commerce in any one nation promotes the riches and commerce of all its neighbors. So if one nation becomes richer thanks to trade, all the nations will profit. A state can scarcely carry on its trade and industry very far if all the surrounding states are in ignorance and barbarism. So if you want to prosper, you have an interest in seeing your neighbors prospering too. Interdependence benefits to all the states. The same idea was put forward a bit later by the founding father of contemporary liberal economic doctrine, liberalism, Adam Smith. Adam Smith, it's the French translation of his inquiry into the nature and the causes of the wealth of nations. The wealth of nations, la richesse des nations. How do states become, how do nations become rich? Because of domestic economic reasons, but also because of their commercial practices with other nations. Listen to, and here again he rejects the mercantilist approach. Listen to Adam Smith. Nations have been taught in the past that their interest consisted in baggering their neighbors, in impoverishing their neighbors. Each nation has been made to look with an invidious eye upon the prosperity of all the other nations with which it trades. Each nation has been taught to consider the gains of other states as their loss, the traditional doctrine. Therefore, commerce, and he then insists upon the negative political consequences, commerce which ought naturally to be among nations as among individuals, a bond of union and friendship. Friendship should be favored thanks to commerce. Commerce has become a source of discord and animosity, hostility, rivalry. The capricious ambition of kings, liberals, do not appreciate monarchies. And here we have the complementary approach to the economic, to the thesis of peace through economy, peace through democracy. The capricious ambition of kings and ministers has not been more fatal to the peace of Europe than the jealousy of merchants and manufacturers. So according to Adam Smith, states should drop the idea, the zero-sum conception of trade. All the states will win if one of them wins. And in France, Jean-Baptiste Say put forward exactly the same idea. I translate his French quote: "A nation is with other nations in the same interactions as a province with other provinces within a nation, or as a city with its surrounding countryside. It cannot win without the other one winning too. States, therefore, should favor the enrichment of other states." So these quotes of physiocrats, Jean-Baptiste Say, and liberals, Adam Smith, claim, therefore, put forward two major claims, two major statements. Free trade is inherently favorable, advantages to all the partners having trade with one another, and free trade is a force for peace among trading states. What is this peaceful effect to? We have the response in Montesquieu's Doux Commerce Thesis. I repeat the quote I already gave you: two nations who traffic, who have trade with one another, become reciprocally dependent. One has an interest in buying, the other one has an interest in selling. And thus, their union is founded on their mutual necessities. Reciprocal dependence, ladies and gentlemen, mutual necessities. Here is the core point of the liberal theory, claiming that interdependence is a force for peace. Montesquieu was aware, ladies and gentlemen, that men in general and states are pretty often driven by political passions. But he nevertheless, and this is a typical liberal claim too, believed in a kind of progress, in believing the possibility of men gradually becoming smart enough to promote or to be guided by their interests rather than by their passions, the passions and interests of Hirschman, or Hirschman took it from Montesquieu. Listen to Montesquieu. Happy is it for men that they are in a situation in which, though their passions prompt them to be wicked, to be bad, to be evil, to be egoistic, to be looking for domination, Hobbes, the natural state of nature among men. Though their passions prompt them to be wicked, it is nevertheless to their interest to be virtuous, to be humane. So interests gradually. The fact for rational men, and therefore for rational statesmen, to be guided by their rational interest rather than by their political passions, will end up favoring peace. Why? Because a nation state, having trade with another state, will increase its own richness, its own prosperity, the wealth of its population. It would then be irrational, because counterproductive, because foolish, to go to war with the trading partner, because by going to war, it would interrupt the major cause of its own rising well-being. So war, in other words, in such an economically interdependent world, will gradually become useless, because trade will permit a state to obtain richness and therefore power without going to war. And since war is costly, and since war is since nobody can never know exactly how a war will end, risky, since war is costly and risky, it is more rational to obtain the same richness thanks to trade rather than thanks to violence. War is obsolescent because economic trade has a greater expected utility. It costs less, and actually it costs nothing, but it provides a lot of richness. So it permits, in a more rational way, a state to obtain what it is looking for, be this objective a purely economic one, the richness of the population, or be it a political one or a military one, because there can be no political or military strategic power without economic consolidated infrastructure. This is the liberal thesis. Peace through interdependence. Why? Because trade around us was useless, irrational, counterproductive, and ultimately obsolescent. This liberal theory gradually became prevailing, dominant mainstream throughout the 19th century. First and foremost, of course, in Great Britain. First and foremost in Great Britain, a lot of thinkers, be they economists or more general political or philosophical thinkers, elaborated on this piece through interdependence thesis, which was proposed first in France, which is a bit surprising. So we have, for instance, Jeremy Bentham at the end of the 18th century, who criticized the colonial uselessness the economic uselessness of colonial conquest. We should quote Richard Cobden, who was at the origin in the midst of the 19th century of the abolition of the protectionist corn laws in Great Britain. And last but not least, Norman Angell. Sir Norman Angell, who wrote an important book at the eve of World War I called The Great Illusion. The Great Illusion. Angell belongs to the idealist approach of international relations, which, you know, that prevailed in the discipline of international relations through the interwar period, after World War I up to 1939, throughout the so-called 20 years crisis, to quote Edward Carr. These idealists also include some authors who wrote immediately before World War I and not during the interwar period. So Norman Angell belongs to these. He belongs to these authors. He wrote The Great Illusion, in which he denounced the futility of war. And a liberal argument, according to him, a state considering that military power is more important than economic richness is absolutely wrong. Listen to this. Those who confound the power of a nation with the size of its army, those who confound the power of a nation with the size of its army are mistaking the checkbook for the money. If you have no money on your banking account, there is no use to have a checkbook, of course. And why do they commit this mistake, according to Angell? Because they forget, I quote, that in a world of economic interdependence, economic force always, on the long run, outweighs physical or military force. So economy is more important, and therefore military force will end up becoming obsolete, a theory put forward at the same time by Schumpeter, whom we saw. According to Schumpeter, economic interdependence, what at that time, or what nowadays we call retrospectively the first globalization, was favorable to peace. And you know how Schumpeter explains the outbreak of World War I. In an economically interdependent world, war will gradually fade away because it will be irrational, and states, therefore, will no longer be war-making machines. This is a realist concept, war-making states. Gilpin used the term war-making machines. The war-making machines, the realists' war-making machines, according to liberals, will be replaced by trading states, and even by virtual states. Trading and state and virtual states, you find the references in the bibliography, are two terms. Trading state is a more general term, but the virtual state is a term put forward by Richard Rosecrans, French translation, l'état virtuel, the virtual state. And Richard Rosecrans, this goes back to the 1990s, so roughly 20 years ago, he claimed that states such as the future will consist in states that absolutely have almost no territorial basis, such as Singapore, such as Hong Kong, such as Luxembourg, because they become virtual states, a very typical liberal argument. So from Montesquieu, almost throughout the 19th century, and to some extent also during the 20th century, the liberal theory, the liberal thesis, according to which economic interdependence both permits the increase of the population's wealth and permits peace to prevail, permits to prevent wars from breaking out. This thesis was dominating. But as usual, ladies and gentlemen, not everybody agrees with this fairly optimistic analysis. Realists, as usual again, do criticize it. They criticize it, and they have an indirect, they found an argument indirectly in the liberal doctrine itself, in the liberal theory itself. Indeed, the founding father of liberalism, that is to say, Adam Smith himself, in his inquiry upon the origins of the wealth of nations, though of course being favorable to free trade, nevertheless accepted one exception. He acknowledged one exception to to the prevalence of free trade, which he cherished, being a liberal. And this exception in his own essay is related to the British Acts of Navigation. The British Navigation Acts were adopted under Cromwell in 1651. 1651, ladies and gentlemen, those who take my History of International Politics class may know that, should know that. 1651, that is to say the second half of the 17th century, a lot of wars broke out, and among these wars, those opposing the British to the Dutch. The British to the Dutch for what? For the control of the sea routes, of the trading routes. Two major Anglo-Dutch wars broke out. The one permitted the British to transform New Amsterdam into New York. The link between these wars and Adam Smith is the following one. The British, Cromwell, he who had killed then British king during the Glorious Revolution. During the Glorious Revolution, maybe I committed a mistake. Anyway, no, not during the Glorious Revolution, which took place when the English monarchy came back at the end of the 17th century. Sorry for this confusion. Anyway, Cromwell adopted the Act of Navigation, the Navigation Acts, in order for the British ships and the British sailors to profit from a monopoly of the carrying trade. They did no longer want to be in competition with the Dutch ships and the Dutch sailors. So a monopoly, by definition, is the opposite of free trade. And Adam Smith is aware of this, and yet, he thinks that the Navigation Acts were justified. Listen to Adam Smith. There seems to be one exception, in which it will generally be advantageous to put some burden upon foreign countries for the encouragement of domestic industry. So we should encourage, protect to some extent domestic industry. And this one case is when some particular sort of industry is necessary, listen to this, is necessary for the defense of the country, is necessary for the defense of the country. The defense of Great Britain, for example, depends very much upon the number of its sailors and its shipping. The Act of Navigations, therefore, the one adopted in 1651, very properly, he agrees with it, very properly endeavors to give the sailors and shipping of Great Britain the monopoly of trade of their own country, by putting heavy burdens upon the shipping of foreign countries, and notably the Dutch. So he agrees, he acknowledges that this is not favorable to wealth. The Act of Navigation is not favorable to foreign commerce or to the growth of that opulence, that richness which can arise from it. Okay? The interest of a nation in its commercial relations to foreign nations is to buy as cheap and to sell as expensive as possible. So free trade should prevail. However, and here he justifies why he accepts this exception. However, as defense is of much more importance than opulence, as defense is of much more importance than richness, the Act of Navigation is perhaps the wisest of all commercial regulations of England. So Adam Smith, the liberal Adam Smith, favorable to free trade, accepts that there can be exceptions to this general principle, exceptions when the defense of a country is at stake. Why? Because the defense, the security, the survival of a state is more important than its wealth, than its well-being, than the well-being of its population. This is a realist statement. He reintroduces the realist statement, according to which states first and foremost have to look for their security, And once the security guaranteed, they can look for other objectives, such as the economic well-being of its population. Defense is of much more importance than opulence. A liberal economist such as Adam Smith acknowledges the realist hierarchy of security being preeminent, the condition of any other objective, including richness. Of course, then this, of course, opens a breach within which the realists can attack. This attack will start with the American Revolution. It will start with the American Revolution with one of the Federalists, Alexander Hamilton. He who contributed together with John Jay and James Madison to the Federalist Papers who were in favor of the federal constitution, which the US adopted in 1787, that is to say 11 years after their successful wars, the successful wars of the 13 former colonies from Maine and Vermont and Massachusetts to Virginia. Alexander Hamilton, among these Federalists, among the three authors of the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton was the realist in the domain of foreign affairs, and he also put forward in one of these articles, one of these Federalist Papers, the idea that trade is anything but peaceful. A typical realist claim. Listen to Hamilton. Has commerce, so still commerce is used and not trade, has commerce hitherto up to then done anything more than change the objects of war? Is not the love of wealth as enterprising a passion as the love of power or glory? So states go to war either for their power, for their glory, or for their wealth. This is what Thucydides said, what Hobbes said, what Aron will be saying, the three objectives. Have there not been as many wars founded upon commercial motives as before in the past, occasioned by the search for territory or domination? Has not the spirit of commerce, the spirit of trade, in many instances, administered new incentives to the appetite, both for conquest and for domination? And then he gives examples of past commercial republics, Athens, Rome, and Carthage were republics. Athens and Carthage were commercial republics, yet they were as often engaged in wars as non-commercial ones. They were as often engaged in wars, offensive and defensive. So trade is anything but a force for peace. So Adam Smith, despite himself, Alexander Hamilton, and last but not least, the most important criticism against the liberal optimistic thesis of peace through interdependence will be put forward in the midst of the 19th century, the very end of the first half of the 19th century, by the German Friedrich List. Friedrich List, who wrote, roughly at the same time as Karl Marx wrote his Manifesto of the Communist Party in the 1840s, his national system of political economy. The national system of political economy. This is the French translation of the German original. And this goes much further than, of course, Smith, but also of Hamilton. So he can be considered as the founding father, the father maybe of contemporary economic nationalism, economic sovereignty. So his starting point, ladies and gentlemen, is his difference. The difference that he makes between national economies, which he also called political economy, and what he calls the world economy, which he also calls the cosmopolitical economy. So cosmopolitical versus political economy, world economy versus national economy. According to Friedrich List, the liberals, the physiocrats before, but the liberals above all in the 19th century, commit a mistake, commit a confusion. They mistake what they think is the reality for what actually is a wishful thinking. That is to say, according to liberals, we live in a world economy where everybody profits from interdependence. We live in a cosmopolitical economy, according to liberals, but they are wrong, because the reality actually is a reality of independent national economies, independent from each other. There is no universal commercial republic. This was a term put forward by the French Quinet, one of the French physiocrats. There is no universal commercial republic. Liberals, according to List, committed the mistake, I quote, of having assumed of being actually in existence a state of things which has yet to come into existence. They mistake the present for the future. There is no world economy yet. There are only national economies, plural and in competition with one another. The actually existing world, I quote, is still separated into distinct nationalities, distinct from other societies and opposed to one another. So politically speaking, or theoretically speaking, in the domain of political relations, international political relations, List is a realist. Is a realist. Each nation, each unit, each nation state is committed in a never-ending state of war. It must therefore prepare, maybe, to wage a war one day or another. In order to do so, it must be able to possess a solid, efficient industry. Such an industry, and here we come to what contemporary ideas put forward too, such an industry must be protected in order to be able to consolidate itself. Because during the earliest stages of a nation's economic development, industrial development, if a state opens its borders to goods, to products coming from other states, it will not be able to consolidate its own industry. If a state opens its frontiers to economically more developed states, then, listen to this, the first state that opens its borders will favor a universal subjection of the less advanced nations to the supremacy of the predominant manufacturing, commercial, and naval power. List was a German. Germany at that time, the Holy Roman Empire no longer existed. It had been dissolved by Napoleon in 1806. The Germans tried to establish a kind of unified entity, but unified Germany only emerged in 1870 thanks to Prussia's war against Austria and France. So during the kind of transition period from the beginning of the 19th century up to the end of the 1860s, the German units established a kind of customs unity in the domain customs union in order to privilege their economic interactions against what List perceived, rightly so, as the predominant manufacturing, commercial, and naval power, that is to say, Great Britain, whose economy was at that time dominating the rest of the world. So a state must protect its industry. It is only thanks to this protectionist policy that it will be able to develop its own important industry, its own commercial navy, its own efficient agriculture. And once it will achieve these results, it can open its borders, because then it will have a balanced trade. And here we come back to the mercantilist claim, according to which trade is only should only be practiced as long as it is at least balanced, as long as you do not win less than your trading partner. If a state accepts to have trade before having a chance to be an equal partner, I quote, it will be in the situation of a child wrestling with a strong man and, of course, unable to resist. So protectionism is a necessity. It is a necessity, and it is necessary in order for a state to start its own development, and it is also a necessary stage in order for the so-called universal commercial republic to emerge later, once all the states, or the most important ones, as usual, being a realist, he's only interested in important, powerful nations. Once the most important nations will have consolidated their industries, then trade indeed will be a force for peace among equally developed nations. Among equally developed nations. The system of protection, I quote, inasmuch as it forms the only means of placing those nations which are far behind in civilization on equal terms with the one predominating, always this reference to Great Britain, the system of protection appears to be the most efficient means of furthering the final union of nations, and hence also promoting the true, the genuine freedom of trade. Trade will only be genuinely free if it is practiced by equally developed nations. As long as they are unequally developed, the poorer one will always be losing if it dares have trade with the strongest, the most developed, the richest nations. It is this idea that, to some extent, contemporary realists will rediscover. Of course, they will drop the somehow nationalist dimension of Friedrich List, favorable to German unity, very critical of the British predominance because of the rivalry, of course, between the British and the French, the British and the Germans. Sorry. So they dropped the somehow disturbing political dimensions of the book, but they refer to the somehow purely economic arguments. According to realists, economic interdependence does not mean mutual dependence as claimed by Montesquieu. There is no mutual reciprocity. There is no reciprocal dependence. Sorry. There is no, what was the expression of Montesquieu? I find it. Their union, mutual necessities and reciprocal dependence. States are reciprocally dependent, therefore their union is founded on mutual necessities. This does not exist for protectionists, nationalists, or realists in the domain of international relations. Economic interdependence does not mean mutually profitable dependence. It actually means reciprocal vulnerability among, by definition, two unequally developed nations. So the only way to favor peace is to remain independent economically. For realists, ladies and gentlemen, economic independence is a force for peace. For liberals, economic interdependence is a force for peace. So it's exactly the perfect opposition. Indeed, for contemporary realists, Kenneth Walls, who in this book also uses these arguments, for contemporary realists, a state which has trade with another state depends, at least for some goods, depends for its economic prosperity, it depends on its trade. Now, the economic prosperity is at the basis of military strength. So its military strength depends on those goods that it will import from foreign industry, from foreign economies. And its security, by definition, depends on its military force, which depends on trade. In other words, a state which is interdependent is very likely to put its security at stake because its security will depend on what those states that provide these goods that the first state will import, this state will depend on the goodwill of these other states, and therefore it is vulnerable. Such a state will be vulnerable to the trading partner's decision to supply it or not with those goods that the first state does not produce itself. In other words, to put it differently, for Kenneth Waltz, the more a state is interdependent, the more it is dependent, and the more it is vulnerable. So interdependence means dependence, which means vulnerability. Listen to Waltz, page 143. Interdependence suggests reciprocity among parties. There is no reciprocity. There is no reciprocal dependence as claimed by Montesquieu. Why? Because, I quote, page 152, the inequality of nations is the dominant fact of international political life. The inequality of nations is the dominant political fact of political life. So interdependence, in fact, means mutual dependence, unequal dependence, and therefore vulnerabilities, because there is no equality. So what do states want to do? What do they want to do? Since they are rational and since they have to look for their security, well, they will try to set themselves free from any vulnerability due to interdependence, because interdependence means dependence. So they may be tempted to go to war in order to put an end to this vulnerability. Interdependence, therefore, is not a force for peace. It is actually a force for war. It is a war-prone factor, variable. Either states, first states, try not to become interdependent, and if they are unable to do so, once they are interdependent, they do not hesitate to try to break free from their interdependence, and sometimes they may be tempted to go as far as to go to war in order to do so. In other words, to sum up, for realists, independence, economic independence, as less trade as possible, is a force for peace, and this is what Waltz sums up when talking of the Cold War, economic independence of the United States from the USSR and vice versa. It is fortunate for states to be more involved in their national economies than they are international. It is fortunate for states to focus on their national economy rather than to be involved in international economy. So let's sum up this debate, this controversy between the liberals and the realists' approach of the links between interdependence and war and peace. Both look at the same reality. There is an interdependence, of course. Nobody can deny this reality, but they do analyze it exactly in a diametrically opposed analysis. For liberals, interdependence is a force for peace, first because it permits states to enrich themselves, to increase the wealth of their population. So states are tempted to commit themselves in economic interdependence, to get involved in international trade because of the gains they expect for their population in terms of well-being. And once they are interdependent, which is rational for them given the positive gains they obtain, once they are interdependent, they have absolutely no more interest in interrupting this interdependence by going to war against their trading partners. So since once the states are interdependent, they will behave peacefully in their mutual relations. For realists, it's exactly the opposite. And ladies and gentlemen, somehow the root, the basic starting point of the difference is at least as philosophical, even metaphysical as it is scientific or theoretical. For liberals, basically, people and therefore states look for their well-being. For realists, men, people, and therefore states, first and foremost, look for their survival. So for liberals, men are economic animals, and for realists, men are political animals. So for realists, then, economic interdependence is a cause of war, is a factor favoring indirectly the outbreak of war, because they focus not on the economic gains that interdependence permits states to obtain. The realists focus on the political costs that may and sometimes are implied, maybe and sometimes actually are implied by free trade and interdependence. Because a state being interdependent actually is dependent and therefore depends on other states' resources. So economy is a reason of war, is a cause of war, because security remains the most important objective that states are to look for, have to look for, are looking for. So they try to prevent themselves from becoming too interdependent, because this would mean too dependent. If they don't manage to do so, they look for the first opportunity to break free, including by going to war in order to no longer be vulnerable. Two absolutely opposed interpretations of the links between interdependence and war and peace. And as usual, I feel free to ask the question, who's right and who's wrong? At first sight, ladies and gentlemen, at first sight, the liberals are right, because they can put forward at least two significant historical periods characterized all at once by economic free trade, interdependence, growing interdependence, and peace among major powers. The first period is the 19th century. No major war after Napoleon's defeat up to World War I, 1914. The so-called long 19th century, no major war, only limited wars. And the 19th century is the century of the rise of capitalism and the rise of economic interdependence, of free trade, thanks to the British economy, notably. And the second example is after 1945, no major war since 1945, and we know that economic interdependence has been booming since America became the prevailing power after World War II. And to these two positive empirical corroborations of the liberal thesis, liberals add two negative arguments. The World War I broke out when precisely the major economies dropped free trade, when they adopted protectionist policies. So protectionist policies at the eve of World War I can be correlated to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. And the same thing is true to some extent for World War II. So this is the liberal empirical corroboration, but realists, as usual, do not agree. They focus precisely on the fact that at the eve of World War I and somehow after the economic depression of the Great Depression of 1929, they focus on the fact that the states, despite their being interdependent, did not hesitate to adopt protectionist policies, which then favored the outbreak of war, or were followed by the outbreak of war. This argument is notably put forward by Catherine Barbieri in different publications and also in the collection that she edited with Schneider and Gleditsch, Globalization and Armed Conflicts. You find the book in today's bibliography. So despite being economically interdependent, states do not hesitate to go to war. We know that during the so-called first globalization, France, Germany, and England were the three most interdependent national economies at that time, and yet they went to war against each other, the British and the French together against the Germans. So how do realists explain this? Well, they explain this by the fact either that precisely because they felt vulnerable, the states did not hesitate to go to war against each other, and a more moderate realist explanation merely would claim that for states, political passions or political motivations are more important than economic interests or economic rationality. And Kenneth Walls, of course, puts forward the example that I already gave you of the Cold War. Yes, there was no war that broke out between the French, the Germans, the British, the Italians. the Japanese, the Americans, the Canadians. Maybe, and this is what liberals say, because of their economies being intertwined, being mutually interdependent. But Walls, of course, puts forward the fact that no war broke out between the Americans and the Westerners more general and the Soviets. And this absence of war is more significant, according to him, being a realist, but also because of the political rivalries between the two, than Eastern and Western blocs. But he also, of course, puts forward the fact that maybe, and according to him, it's more than merely maybe, it is also because of their mutual economic independence. There were no trade relations, almost no trade relations between the Soviets and the Americans. And the Cold War remained cold, did not escalate into a hot war, thanks also to this economic independence. So as usual, ladies and gentlemen, empirical records it is unable to decide which empirical record is the one favoring or corroborating the realists or the one corroborating the liberals is more significant than the other one. I already told you this. Social sciences, social theories, social models, social science models are never corroborated empirically 100%. Therefore, all theories will find their historical examples. You just need to look for it and you find it. Therefore, to some extent, there will be no unambiguous conclusion that we can draw regarding the debate between liberals and realists. And this is what Gilpin wrote in the second major book that he wrote in the 1980s, The Political Economy of International Relations. According to Gilpin, no, I quote, generalization is possible. No generalization is possible regarding the relationship of economic interdependence and political behavior of states. No generalization. At times, economic intercourse can moderate these relations. At other times, economic intercourse can aggravate these relations. Trade is not a guarantor of peace. But the collapse of trade has frequently led to the outbreak of an international armed conflict. No generalization is possible. Sometimes peace favors war, trade favors peace. Sometimes trade does not prevent the outbreak of war. Is there a way, ladies and gentlemen, out of this kind of deadlock? Is there a solution? Maybe there is. Maybe there is, because such a way out of this deadlock was proposed by a more contemporary American author, Dale Copeland, first in an article and then in a book called Economic Interdependence and War. And in his researches, Dale Copeland puts forward what he calls the trade expectation theory, which permits him to explain why sometimes liberals are right and why sometimes realists are right. According to Copeland, the risks of war, the chances of peace are not correlated to the volume, the amount, the absolute amount of trade that states have. Do they trade or do they not? Are they interdependent or are they not? But the risks of war, the chances of peace are correlated to the trade expectations, that is to say, to the anticipations that states have of their future trade with a partner which is a potential rival, according to realists. So it's a kind of economic version of Buena de Mesquita's expected utility model of wars. Here it is the expected utility of trade, which is at the core of his framework. So according to Copeland, a state that expects that its trade will go on in the future, and even will increase in the future, and all the more so, a state that expects that its trade will increase in the future has absolutely no interest in interrupting the trade by going to war, since it can expect this trade to permit it to increase its own wealth. Conversely, a state that anticipates that there will be no more trade, or there will be a decreased amount of trade in the future, can logically come to the conclusion that it has no more interest in betting on trade, and therefore the alternative strategy, the alternative instrument, war, may once again become a rational instrument in the case of an anticipated decline of the benefits of trade in the future. And then Copeland, of course, looks for empirical corroborations of his thesis, of his hypothesis, and he finds, notably Japan and the USSR, but above all Japan at the eve of World War II, as a corroboration of his thesis. Japan, ladies and gentlemen, being a small island, was dependent during its expansion in the 1920s, 1930s, was depending on the goods, the raw materials that it had to import from the different neighboring countries on the Asian continent, of course, the Far Eastern Asian continent. But Japan gradually became a rival of the US, and the US, in its competition with Japan, decided an economic embargo, economic sanctions against Japan. Japan, therefore, could no longer, according to Copeland, expect trade to go on. And since Japan was depending on its trade, on the goods that it was importing, well, it decided to attack the US in order to break free from this vulnerability. And Japan, therefore, attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. The second corroboration, according to Copeland, the second corroboration of his theory is the Cold War. If you look at the Cold War, we saw this, there are periods of high tensions and periods of dialogue. And he considers, he proves to some extent that the period of dialogue were preceded by increasing the trade relations. 1960s, at the beginning of the 1960s, the Americans, for the first time after the Cuban Missile Crisis, accepted to sell wheat and other cereals to the Soviets. The Soviets were unable to produce enough food for their own population. And according to Copeland, this treaty signed and permitting the Soviets to import goods, the Soviets bet on the American goods for their own population, permitted the political relations to warm up a little bit, to heat up a little bit, because there was no more the prevailing tension, the tension that had prevailed earlier. And of course, according to Copeland, after Gorbachev's arrival to power, also the commercial relations increased between the two states. Well, more specifically, the Americans accepted to sell economic commercial goods to the Soviets, and this permitted actually the end of the Cold War. So there is a link between positive expected trade, between positive trade expectations and peaceful behavior of the partners concerned. Copeland's thesis, ladies and gentlemen, is pretty interesting, both because of its empirical record and because of its theoretical perspectives that it opens. Regarding the empirical record, Copeland is interesting because he permits to refute the new liberal arguments, which the liberals, by definition, put forward nowadays since World War I, since they cannot but come to the conclusion that sometimes economically interdependent states nevertheless go to war against each other, World War I. So in order to propose alternative, complementary but alternative explanations to why nevertheless trade is peaceful, is a force for peace, Liberals nowadays focus more on indirect and somehow social, sociological, societal arguments rather than strictly economic ones. What they say is that in the contemporary world, the economy, the trade, favors a change of values, favors a change of interests within the society. Since the more and more people are profiting, the bourgeois class, to use a Marxist term, since more and more people are profiting from trade, privately speaking, as a social group, they would be opposed to any resort by their state to violence. So it is the liberal thesis of Moravchik, according to whom important groups in society pressure the governments to do what is in their interest. So if it is in their interest not to wage wars because they profit from economic trade, the government will not dare launch war against the trading partner. So it is an indirect positive impact of trade upon peace. Trade favors specific categories of a state's population. The rationality of these categories and their capacity to impose their will upon governments will favor peace. Copeland somehow proves indirectly that this is too optimistic, with precisely the example of the Cold War. During the Cold War, the American political administration was able to impose its will upon, for instance, American farmers, who were, of course, eager to sell their goods, their wheat, their corn, their cereals to the Soviets. But this only worked when the American administration admitted this to take place. All the strategically, even indirectly important products of the American industry, computers, etc., were not exported to the USSR, despite the profit which the private American firms would have earned thanks to these exports. Why? Because the American administration did not want the Soviets to profit from the highly developed American products to increase their military apparatus. So the political administration, the political decision makers do command over the societal groups, according at least this empirical example. So therefore, I think that Copeland is interesting empirically. He's also interesting theoretically because of the perspective that he opens. So let's sum up his idea, his thesis. Peace is favored when states expect that trade to go on, and all the more so when states expect that trade to increase. The question then we may ask is the following one: when do states expect that trade to go on? When can rationally, reasonably, states expect that trade will go on in the future? Maybe, this is my response, maybe when there is a kind of treaty signed by the states, committing themselves to trade, to go on trading during a specific period, during a certain lapse of time. To put it differently, ladies and gentlemen, maybe international trade, international economic interdependence is not a force for peace per se, as such. Maybe it is a force for peace when it is embedded in international institutions, in international treaties, in international regimes that are signed by the states who involve themselves, who commit themselves to respect their promise to go on trading, not to adopt protectionist policies, not to raise the tariff barriers, etc., etc. And if we look at the two world wars, maybe, and this could be a kind of response to the debate between the liberals, could be, between the liberals and the realists. Maybe World War I and World War II broke out despite the then prevailing economic globalization or interdependence. because there were no international regimes permitting the states to peacefully resolve their economic rivalries. There were no international economic institutions. They were established after World War II. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which became the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, have been permitting, since 1945, the states to negotiate peacefully in order to find together by consent, by dialogue, by a bit of bargaining, of course, maybe by a bit of blackmailing too, but not by resorting to war, and this is very important, their economic rivalry. We thus come, ladies and gentlemen, to the second major liberal analysis of the relations between the second major liberal analysis of war and peace, the theory according to which institutions do favor peace. This is what we have a look at next week, logically. I wish you a great day. Hope you will be back next week. Thank you so much for listening today. Goodbye.